the Ukrainian women who picked up weapons and stuff. What I find is that when we then say, hang on a second, there's also this cohort of women who are non-violent, self-empowered, and I always use this, they've self-empowered. My job, or those of us internationally, is to enable them, but they don't need me to empower them. Can we recognize what they're doing and bring them into the fore, and to recognize that their peace work is actually really, really difficult? There is huge resistance because they're challenging every status quo, right? If the reason, I remember being in Nepal and 15 years of war, and finally there were some peace talks, and again, women had been very active in various ways, and 8 political parties despised each other, couldn't agree on anything. But when it came to saying there should be Nepalese women at the peace talks, unified stance, absolutely not, right? And we see this repeatedly. And I think that what happens is that when you bring these women in, they challenge the narratives of the government or the opposition, and they hold them accountable. The research that we have shows that if you have strong women's movements present and women present in these spaces, those peace agreements hold better. And the reason why they hold better is because it becomes much more real. The conversation and the accountability afterwards becomes more real. But these parties don't want them there. And then that fits very nicely with the international way of doing things, which is to try and say, oh, well, we just need to go talk to the guys with the guns or the guys with power, bang a few heads, do some power sharing. That's what happens all the time. And I was in Somalia when they were having one of these power sharing conversations, and it was a famine. And I was like, everyone's dying. There's no water. The women's organizations that were doing humanitarian work had boycotted the conference, but the men were there in their suits and wanting to sort of carve up the country to have a federal state. So I said to my UN colleagues, and maybe this is also academic thing, I said, why do we keep talking about power sharing? Why don't we flip the conversation and the terminology and talk about responsibility sharing? That you want to be Minister of Finance, you want to be Minister of whatever, Galmudug state, great. What are you going to do about water, food, safety for your public? Because power is for me. Responsibility is my role towards, right? And so there was kind of the exclusion, or trying to frame women as people that need help, need our help, but they shouldn't do more than that, or people, women that have transgressed norms, and we're slightly fascinated by that. This peace builder community we're not really sure about because, what are they? What governments have done is now they've called it women mediators. And I'm like, peace builders do mediation work, but a mediator means that you don't have a political agenda. You're like, oh, the two sides, it's like, no, we're talking about people who are on the ground and they actually have something. And they bring a mediation lens, they bring a rights lens. They're not just human rights activists, because as a human rights activist, you don't, you take a much more clear position about what to do with perpetrators. Peace builders navigate a really murky space because you're thinking about, you're thinking about ending the violence and preventing future harm, right? That's kind of part of the work. But at the same time, of course, you have to think about the harm that's been done and the injustices, and you don't want impunity. And so these are really complex spaces, psychologically, emotionally, and so forth. But they're constantly in addressing these things. And so it's a very lonely space, actually. It's a very, very lonely space because constantly, human rights activists are, you guys aren't trustworthy, you're siding with the other one, or, yeah. So that's why my work, we're like trying to say that this exists. There are people like this. How do you, at least can we recognize them, even if it becomes a hard place to be? Can we recognize and see what that, what can be done to support?
Yes, go ahead and then.
Sure. Hi, I'm a PhD student here at the Computer Science Department of the school. Earlier you discussed that what motivates your work is the transition from a dictatorship to democracy without war. And you talked about your experiences talking about nonviolence, not making it seem like you're asking people who are resisting to stand down.
So, thank you. I think there are lots of different parts of that. So, number one, for sure, the majority, I mean, I've seen it in Washington, that of course nobody wants war, and majority of people didn't even want sanctions, because sanctions, as we've seen, have emboldened the state in a way that I think has enabled corruption, enabled the violence, and so forth. So, but we can talk about sanctions separately if you want. But if you think about, going back to Syria, if you think about what Omar was saying about Syria, where people were on the streets for months saying no to foreign intervention, no to violence, no, and they were being met with the violence of the state. At what we've seen, okay, and this isn't what I want, but what we see happens is that at some point, early on, late on, whatever, there are different forces that begin to converge around these contexts. And it becomes, it's no longer about the Syrian protesters in some ways, right? It becomes about a minority, it becomes about ways in which regional powers and others want to diminish what's going on or take advantage of what's going on. If I go back to the Syrian context, at some point there were like 5 wars happening in the same place. There was Syrian government versus its own people. There was Iran, Saudi. There was Russia, US. There was Iran, US, all in the same place because they could. Not because the public wanted it, because they could. And you then look at, if you take a broad look at the Middle East, and this is a question I kind of ask people. I say, imagine if Iraq or Libya had emerged as a really strong, legitimate democracy with their oil, with their educated public, and a democracy. Do we think that democracy would have something to say about what's happening to Palestinians? Would they have something to say about Saudi spreading of Wahhabism? Would they have something to say about the UAE becoming more militant and kind of? I think they would. I think, and so then you flip it and you say, well, to whose advantage is it that Iraq, Libya, and all these places have become kind of failed states? And I say this because it's as much as the Iraqi population or the Libyan population or the Syrian population or the Iranian population wants democracy and air and to have justice and so, there are lots of forces that don't want it. And so we can't be naive about thinking, oh, everybody's with us, right? There are lots of forces that don't. And so being conscious of that is one thing. Second thing is, when we think about the question of solidarity from the outside world, and this is I don't have an answer to this, and this is why I'm like, let's talk about it. Let's as diaspora populations, let's have a serious conversation, because we're saying we want solidarity. At the moment, the solidarity is saying, please echo and hear what we're saying, what's being said out there, right? What's happening to Iranians, just keep the attention and so forth. How else, can we make sure that internet connectivity is present? Do we think that using our international spaces matters, right? So you have the Human Rights Council. Over 1 million people signed the petition, the amnesty petition, from 220 countries to say there should be investigative mechanisms. These are positive forms of solidarity, right? Because it's giving teeth to the institutions that are out there. Do I think, and again, this is my personal opinion, you might disagree with it. Do I think that calling for every country to send, close down Iranian embassies and send home the diplomats, do I think that's a good idea? I don't, for the simple reason that I think having foreign presence in the country, the embassies and so forth, is useful. It's good to have the eyes on the ground. It's good for people, foreigners, to be there and see and feel it. It's also good in case, God help us all, if people need visas to get out, to be safe, right? you can always shut down your embassy if you want, but I don't think that you want to help the isolation because I think that helps the regime. So it's a debate. It's a debate to be had. Do I think that we should be kicking Iran out of FIFA? Personally, no, because I think it's an amazing global platform to have the voice of the Iranian public. So there are ways in which you can have solidarity to keep the focus there. And the question from an outside perspective is, how do we help reduce the form of, when 277 parliamentarians sign a letter saying that, or vote to say we want to execute all the protesters, I think that all the public pressure, both inside and outside, has helped for some of them at least, to retract. The last I heard was that people were saying, oh, this is fake news and so on. I don't know. But it's these types of things really, really matter, right? Now, moving forward to, resistance and nonviolence and so, again, that's something that the local population has to figure out for themselves. What people, and this is why I'm saying, when I see the kids and they're saying, if you kill one of us, 100 come forward, and they're willing to die, it breaks my heart. But I can't decide for them, right? What I hope is that they are conscious enough, the public is conscious enough to know that there are lots of insidious forces that will want to use this moment to try and, as we say in Farsi, run mice, mushtoidan, into the system and create the havoc. There are lots of forces that could easily come along and do false flag operations, or just being conscious of the fact that while these protests are going on, there are negative forces that will also want to take advantage. And so there is a kernel, and somebody might turn around and say, oh, you sound like the regime. No, I'm not, of course I'm, but what I'm saying is that there's a kernel of truth in all these things, that there are forces that don't want Iran to be a viable country, even a viable democratic country. I know from my partners that there is a huge amount of wariness about this being a sort of a clarion call of women, life and freedom across the Arab world. They're all looking at it and saying, what? You guys are going to do that? We don't want that, right? So lots of people want it to fail. And all I'm saying is we need to be conscious of that. And so the questions around strategies that people have are important. The question around, let's, you have a country of 80 million people. Let's say 1 million of them are diehard supporters of the regime. What's the dialogue with them? What do we do? What's the message? Or is it a message that, oh, if the revolution happens, everyone's going to be, killed? Is that the, these are important things to think about, right? And the timing may not be right. The timing may be that people right now are super emotive about these things, and it's too early to, but it is part of the conversation that how, in Syria, there was a percentage that supported the Syrian regime at some point, right? You gotta, if we become about wanting to eradicate the other side, we're no better than